Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my NACL round number 1 and kind of round number 2 overview and analysis video for the playoffs. We are finally here. We are in the Spring Split playoffs. We've got our 8 teams that have officially made it, and unlike a lot of the other regions, all of 8 of these teams, I should say, start on the same playing field. They are all in upper bracket. All of them do get that extra life. I think this gives more of an opportunity for upsets, more of an opportunity for interesting series, and obviously it gives all the teams that made it basically equal footing. Now, not all of them have easy matchups. We'll definitely talk about that, but this was a jam-packed, amazing weekend of action for the NACL. So many games, so many back-and-forth series. We really got a good idea. There was a good amount of upsets. This was just everything you could have asked for out of the first weekend of playoffs and then some, so I'm very excited to go over it, but of course, I want to know you guys' thoughts and opinions on everything down in the comments section below. We certainly got some fun series, so once again, as per usual, let me know what series you were most interested in, what series you thought was the most interesting to watch, what the best games were. I just want to know your thoughts on everything going on in the NACL. There were definitely some upsets in terms of seeding, but are you shocked with how some of these outcomes went? Would just love to know your thoughts and opinions on everything down below. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts on everything that's happened in the NACL to get to this point in the playoffs, you can check out the NACL playlist up in the iCard. That's, of course, going to have every single weekly review that I did for the NACL so far in 2024. But today, we're going to be going over the first 8 series. Yes, 8 that we got in the first week of action. I know it's a lot, but it's definitely worth it. There was a lot of really good action, and if you are new here, what we're going to do in this video is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series, and then, of course, at the end of the video, we're going to go over where the bracket is looking like at the current moment, what teams are still alive in the upper bracket. Spoiler alert, obviously, we'll know our winners' finals by the end of this episode. We'll also know our first 2 teams eliminated by the end of this episode. So a lot's going to happen here on weekend number 1, and I don't want to waste too much of you guys' time, so let's jump right into it. Of course, we get to start off with our number 1 versus number 8 matchup, our top seed versus our bottom seed, at least going into the playoffs, and it was definitely a lot closer than I think people were anticipating. FlyQuest challengers taking on AOE Esports, and FlyQuest is going to be able to pick up the 2-1 series win, but this was not a pushover series by any means. Fly was definitely pushed to the limit in the back half here, losing game number 2 to AOE, barely winning game number 3, actually being in a position where it was kind of likely for them to lose that third and final game. They really had to fight their way out of a bad predicament, but credit to AOE, credit to this team who really fought hard in this series. It's kind of been a weird split, I would say, overall for AOE, because there's moments where they've looked really good, especially in the early parts of the split, when you had players like Onat, Wixie, and Breezy really popping off and playing at a super high level. It's just been the consistency. It's very funny. When you look at their game score at 11 and 13, that's equal in terms of winning percentage to Cincinnati Fear at number 5 seed, but they're the number 8 seed because they just weren't able to close out series. They were pretty consistently able to win at least one game in every series that they played. They just weren't actually able to win as many series as other teams, and so you knew that the competence was there for AOE. You knew this was a relatively okay team, but they overperformed my expectations in this big time. I really did not expect them to be able to go head-to-head with FlyQuest, but Fly definitely happy to be able to walk out of this with a win. Would have been pretty much a disaster if things had gone wrong for them in this. If you're the 1 seed and you lose in the first series of the playoffs, that is not good. That is not what you're looking for, so they avoid that disaster with a win here. Player of the series for me is going to go to Shaden. I think this is a really difficult decision. Both player of the series and dud of the series were very tough to choose from in this one. Typically speaking, you can find at least one player that was very consistent or just dominant throughout the series for the winning team, but I think everybody was good. Maybe not everybody was great. It was either going to be Shaden or it was going to be Sajed for me in terms of the aggressiveness that they showed. I know Shaden led the team in deaths, but they don't win this series, I think, without the plays that he was making on the Sejuani. Also, of course, on the Nocturne in game 1, where I thought he was the most important player in that game. Whether you want to say the Sedge was the most important piece towards game 3, I think that's definitely more debatable, but the fact that he was in the conversation for both of their wins as the most important player, I think for me, gets him player of the series. And obviously, Shaden's been very good. I think this is the best split he's had since he's left Cloud9. A lot of players play their best in terms of Tier 2 when they were on Cloud9, when they were in that organization, so it's nice to see Shaden get a lot more consistent after he just wasn't that on Evil Geniuses for a good amount of time. I think his partnership with Surdy has obviously helped with that a lot, but Sajed has been getting more and more involved as this split has gone along in terms of being a resource carry. I think part of that is just the meta transitioning into being more hyper carry focused in the bot lane. We're seeing Kai'Sa and Aphelios come out towards the back half of this series, even something like a Jinx on the other side of this matchup for AoE, and so you're seeing a lot more prio be put in the bot lane. I think Sajed has lived up to that expectation, and I think he was really good on the Aphelios in Game 3. They don't really win if he's not putting out as much damage. I think Quad is really good. I think a lot of people are really hyping up Quad. Maybe I'm biased, and I'll talk about this, but maybe I'm biased because I've watched him for so long in the LCK, because I've been watching him since 2021 in the LCK. And he's really not all that different to me from what he was in the LCK, which is a really talented laner that is just kind of a part of the team. He's not necessarily the one going out there and making big macro plays. He's more just a part of the team environment. And that's good, like, for a team that's really talented like FlyQuest. I don't think Quad could be your best player and you be, like, a really talented team if the rest of your team is just, like, not good. We've seen it in the past in the LCK. He's just not the kind of player who can put the team on his back like that. But, you know, in terms of individual mechanics, he's probably the #1 mid laner in the NACL. So it's kind of interesting to look at it that way. Surdy is obviously someone I've gone to bat for on this channel a lot, and he continues to be good, even if he wasn't, you know, his dominant self that he had been over the course of the split. In this series in particular, this was definitely a lot closer than maybe Fly anticipated it being, but at the end of the day, they're still able to walk out with a win. But I think it has more to do with AoE playing well than FlyQuest playing bad, and that's kind of the takeaway I want to have here, is the 8 seed, the worst seed coming into this tournament, the bottom seed in AoE, actually looked super good in this first series. Now, it's all for nothing if they go down into lower bracket after this loss and they're not able to maintain this momentum, but at least for now, this was a really good showing. So much so that I really feel bad that I have to give anybody dud of the series, because I think all 5 players for AoE were really good. And certainly, I don't think anybody on Fly ran it down or lost their team that series. If any of them play really bad in that last team fight, they end up losing. I think Chime was definitely in consideration, but I really liked how he played in Game 1 on Rakan, and it just would feel disingenuous to give him dud of the series. So unfortunately, it is going to go to Rosethorn. I thought he was probably the least effective in game number 3, but even saying that, the Jarvan still created a lot of opportunities for AoE. There still were a lot of really good plays. I just think in comparison to everybody else in the game, he was the one champion that I felt wasn't as much of an impact. I think Onat was definitely the star for AoE. Everybody knows I'm in the O Nation. I'm a big fan of Onat. I think he's a really interesting player. Maybe not one of the single best mid laners in the NACL right now, but certainly one that I think is deserving of a spot in Tier 2 at the moment. I think Wixie and Breezy have been great across this split, and Breezy in particular I thought was great in this series. I really like the engages he had on Alistair in Game 2, and the Rel in Game 3 really made things difficult for AoE, or for FlyQuest, to actually commit to any sort of fight. Zamudo had been better in this series than he had been recently. He's been a bit feast or famine for this team, I say in a nice way, and going up against Surdy, I think there was some real concern that top lane was just not going to survive in that matchup, and Zamudo I think was totally fine, and even Rosethorn was solid. Like, he wasn't a problem for this team. I think just when you're looking at the series as a whole, somebody has to get done of the series. That's the format that I have here on this channel, and unfortunately, that goes to Rosethorn. But honestly, this to me is a super encouraging series from AoE. If they can carry this kind of confidence and this kind of momentum into their lower bracket series, which they are now going into, I think they're going to be fine. This is a better performance than most of the other teams that you're going to meet there are going to be able to put out, and I really think that AoE might be a sleeper underdog to continue moving forward, even if I wasn't all that high on them going into this tournament. But for FlyQuest, until proven otherwise, this is the best team in the NACL. I know they dropped to Supernova in the final week, and obviously you would have loved a perfect season from Fly, but outside of that one loss, they've essentially been perfection all year long. This team is ridiculously talented. They should be the best team in the NACL in terms of their roster makeup, and at least in this first series, they are able to get out of dodge and move on to the next round. And then moving on to our second of the first round series here. It's also on the upper side of the bracket, so winner of this plays FlyQuest, loser of this plays AoE. That's how this goes. It was the 4-5 matchup, the two theoretically most evenly matched teams, Wildcard Gaming taking on Cincinnati Fear. And Cincinnati Fear is going to pick up the win as the 5 seed here. They have the same series record going into the playoffs, but obviously Fear lost a few more games over the course of the split, which means they did not get side selection, but it did not matter. They won game 1, they won game 3, they end up walking out of this, moving on to the next round. And while this is a seed upset, this was, I think, pretty predictable for most people. I think a lot of people going into the playoffs had Fear as the better team, including me, who predicted this series to go in favor of Fear, but it was relatively close. Again, credit to Wildcard. They do a couple of things really well. Unfortunately, it just isn't enough to be able to overcome a Fear team that is genuinely very good and actually got a lot of their players back on track. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me, pretty no-brainer, goes to Lens in the bot lane. I think this becomes a lot more difficult if you don't have Lens popping off in that third and final game. I think his ability to move around the map and deal a ridiculous amount of damage in basically every fight that happened for Fear over the course of the entire game was essential for Fear winning. You can talk about how there are obviously big impacts from Toasty, who was great in game 1 in particular on the Orianna, and obviously was still very good in game 3 on the Talia. I'm not trying to take anything away from him. Chad was good in game 3 on the Kindred. Daption was moving around the map well, but I think if Lens doesn't get super fed in that third game, it becomes a lot more difficult to end up shutting down the Smolder. And this again is another game that I would point to as I don't want to say like Smolder apologist, but just as somebody who sits there and says that, yes, Smolder's the strongest champion in the game and is very difficult to deal with, but it's not like impossible to beat. And if it was, obviously it'd be permaban, but you know, you can beat Smolder. As long as you shut him down early, you can get hyper carries that can scale into the late game and be more proactive than he can, like the Kai'Sa was in this. Not saying it's easy. Again, not trying to say that Smolder isn't the strongest champion in the game, just saying that it's not 30-0, right? It doesn't win every single game. It's not unbeatable in that kind of way. And Lens, I think, did a really good job of showing that off by playing aggressive in the mid game and really not allowing Wildcard to scale into the part that you would expect, you know, them to be strong in. Kai'Sa is definitely a champion that you wouldn't necessarily consider a mid-game powerhouse in terms of the mentality that you'd want to play with, but I think Lens definitely did that. Toasty continues to also be very good. I talked about it a lot over the course of this split. Toasty has been one of the more interesting mid laners in the NACL. I think, I'm not going to say that he's been the best or anything like that, but he's certainly been one of the more explosive ones across this split. He's won a lot of games for Fear, and I think he's been a very big positive for this team, in my opinion, the best part of this team, at least in terms of what I've watched over the course of this split. What am I saying? What I've watched. I've watched every game. But obviously, Chad is a big part of that as well, giving a lot of resources to mid lane, actively trying to play through that, and really being a positive. Rengar's become a big part of this team's identity in terms of how they want to play the middle of these series, even the early parts of these series, and Chad's just very good at that champion. Playing things like Kindred also help out a lot. Toasty's very good at these like secondary carry, these more facilitative mid laners like the Karma, like the Talia. Played the Orianna really, really well in game 1. There's positives there. Philip played Renekton in game 2. Typically he saves that for game 3, but you know, he was very good in this series. And Daption, I think, was really solid, especially being able to set up some of these hyper carries. That's really the role that support plays right now in the current meta. But Fear was solid. They kind of showed everything they were showing in the regular season just again here in the playoffs. This wasn't a particularly shocking outcome for me, and Wildcard's a decent team. Like, I'm not trying to sit here and rag on them and say that they're bad, but I do think that, you know, they were number 7 in my power rankings as opposed to somewhere in the top 4, even being a top 4 seed for a reason, and it's because while I do think there are really good parts of this team, I really like Aaron and Doxa in particular. I think they've grown a lot throughout the year. They've been the strong part of this map, and, you know, I don't think there's been a lot of bot lanes that have been the direct carry point for teams in the NACL. I can really only point to a couple of teams that really exclusively play through bot lane. Maybe not play through exclusively, but, you know, bot lane is kind of the priority lane for them, and I think Wildcard definitely applies to that. Aaron is definitely somebody who gets a lot of resources as the hyper carry, and Doxa was a big part of where this team wanted to put its playmaking resources in the mid game in the early part of the split. I think that definitely carried over here. Aaron was definitely the player that they were relying on to carry some of their team fights. Didn't quite end up working out because, like I said, Lens ended up just getting stronger in that third and final game, but Doxa was also pretty good on the Braum. You know, you kind of just need to be able to protect your hyper carry, and I think bot lane was not the problem, and we talked about it going into the playoffs here at the end of the regular season, that bot lane was the strength of this team. Unfortunately, it's just not a complete performance right now. We've seen some lower quality performances from everybody else on this team. I don't think Darkwings has had a particularly great split, especially in comparison to what his career norms have been as a carry. He's just not that for this team over the course of this split. He's been good. He just hasn't been great. He's been average. I think that's a good way to put it. And then the top side of this map has been struggling for a couple of weeks now. Winnie's going to get done of the series here. I don't entirely blame him for how things went down. When you're playing Vi and Sejuani, you're going to look a little bit worse when your team loses pressure, but Chad, I think, was just straight up better in this series in terms of establishing pressure. And, Quacker on the top side was somebody that had been really struggling, but actually I think showed up in this series. I'm a big fan of Quacker, even if he has been struggling as of late. I always have been a big fan of his mechanics. I think 1v1, he can go toe-to-toe with basically anybody in the league. He can be a bit feast or famine, but I really like his, ceiling as a player. But Winnie, I just don't think has had a particularly strong split, and he's a reason why I'm a little bit lower on Wildcard. Not obviously the only reason. I don't think they play around Winnie particularly well, and, his willingness to play facilitators and engage tanks has kind of been, it's made him a bit more of a target than maybe he would be in other situations, but, I'm just not super high on Wildcard going into the playoffs, and I think this series kind of encapsulates why. While they do have good players, and they do have lanes that they can play through, I think in comparison to a lot of the other NACL teams that feel a bit more complete, or at least have the option to be a bit more complete, Wildcard is definitely more of a top-heavy team in terms of the talent that they have. Obviously, they're moving down into lower bracket now to take on AOE. That should be a matchup that they win, but they should not necessarily be considered guaranteed to win that. At least that's what my power rankings would say going into this week. But Fear on the other side, they are a good team. Are they going to be able to compete with a team like FlyQuest? Who knows? Like, they've always punched above their weight in terms of this org, and even this team this year has punched above their weight in a lot of different circumstances. However, that is a big challenge to ask. Fly is a very good team, but if any team is going to actually be able to compete with them, even without, necessarily the expectation to do so, Fear is probably the team on the top side that's going to do that. And then moving on to our third series, we start to get to the lower side of the bracket here, and essentially the bracket split into halves. Not that it matters too much with only 8 teams, but on our lower side, our 2 versus 7 matchup is, of course, Maryville University taking on Disguised. And in a pretty big upset, the biggest of round number 1, in my opinion, Disguised is going to take this series 2-1. This is not how I expected this to go. Not that I thought Disguised was a bad team. In fact, they have not left my top 6 at any point in terms of my power rankings at all this year. They have been firmly there. They've not always been as consistent as maybe you would like. Obviously, they were out of the top 8 for a good portion of this split, but a winning streak with the bottom teams in the back half of the split really gave this team a lot more confidence, and clearly they found a play style in that section of games that they can use to replicate against these better teams. Maryville has been essentially untouchable. Their only loss all split in terms of a series was to FlyQuest, the best team in the league. They have beaten everybody else as we've gone through, and DSG is able to rectify that and change that in this series. And again, it's through a lot of the avenues that they have been progressing with recently as well. So that's what makes it very impressive for DSG. And again, I think this is very good. It's a very good sign that DSG is going to maybe live up to some of the preseason hype, even if they weren't able to do that in the regular season as much. Player of the series for me is going to go to Tenacity in the top lane here for DSG. He's really good, man, and he's been really good over the past couple of weeks. I've very much been on the Tenacity hype train over the past month or so. I think, he started off a bit slow. He really wasn't having that big breakout split that I think a lot of people were expecting considering the talent level he had. And, what he showed in the LCS, he specifically made the decision to come back here to the NACL, I imagine with DSG, because he expected to be the best top laner in the NACL to quickly get another LCS job because of the way he would be able to play in Tier 2. That wasn't necessarily happening at the beginning of the split. His laning took a little bit of time to get back up and back rolling, but I think his confidence has been completely rejuvenated in the last couple of weeks, and honestly, he's been the most valuable player on this team. To me, he is the best player on DSG right now, and we saw that specifically in game number 3. Now, I'm not just talking about game 3. Game 2 was very much great from him as well, but it was more of a team effort. I thought Perry in particular played phenomenal in that second game on Xin Zhao. I really liked him in that second game. It's one of the more consistent ones he's had in a little while. I've been critical of Perry, and Perry was somebody who I was very, very, very high on, not only last year, but going into this year. I had him as my number 1 jungler in the NACL going into 2024. He hasn't necessarily been that. There's been a little bit more bad than you got last year, just in terms of the aggressiveness. It very much felt, and I talked about this all year long, like he has been tilted for a lot of this year, that clearly his mental was affected by the giant losing streak that this team went on in the middle of the split. He's just playing way too aggro, and his team doesn't seem like it is prepared to follow up in those situations. You can get away with that, you know, if your team is willing to match and roam along with you, as we saw last year with Shochi on Fear. But when your team is not necessarily going to be playing with you, you're going to die a lot isolated in those circumstances, and that's kind of been the case, I think, with Perry for a lot of this year. Not that his mechanics have gotten worse, just rather that the situation has changed around him, but I thought this series was pretty good from him. Game 2 in particular, I thought he was by far the best player in the game, but Tenacity is going to get it for the series as a whole because he was so dominant on Gragas in Game 3, and like I said, Tenacity has very quietly been one of the best top laners in the NACL. I think it's him and Surdy. Surdy clearly number 1 for me, but Tenacity has been the second best top laner in the league for me across this year, and I would not have expected that with how he started the split, so really good development from him. I thought Manui was also very good in this series. You know, he's taken some time, I think, to adjust to this team as well. Very much that, you know, traditional weak side AD carry, somebody who has never really received a lot of resources in his time in the NACL, even going back to Fear last year, obviously, really well known for his mages in the bot lane, but he can play hyper carries, he can play Jinx at a high level, he can play Smolder, he can play Varus, he can play AD carries. It's not like he can only play mages. I think that's, you know, a misconception that he potentially gets. Manui is a solid player, he just hasn't necessarily, I think, connected with Poom in the same way that he did with his bot lanes last year, and I think this was a series that kind of shows what could happen if things do go right. I thought Manui was good, Poom was really good, Young was really solid. I think Young has been fine, not necessarily a standout. Again, I think this is also a bit of a regression from his last year, where he really impressed me in terms of his ability to take over games. Even on Golden Guardians, he was really the carry for that team, but DSG showing something in this series that they really have not shown against great teams, against the best teams in the league across this year. They've been able to beat, you know, Mirage and Lit and AOE and Wildcard and teams like that. They've been able to take wins against those kinds of teams, but Maryville felt untouchable in series like this, and DSG very much proved that that was not the case. And for Maryville, going down to lower bracket in this particular side of the bracket is a disaster, because it means you're guaranteed to have to face off against one of either Supernova or Team Liquid challengers for your tournament life, and that is not a series that I would particularly like to have. This is a bad loss for them on, in my opinion, the much harder side of the bracket, and I think they're going to regret not playing as well in this as they could have. Dud of the series is going to go to Spyrax. I've actually really been on the Spyrax hype train. I know everybody's been on the quad train in terms of best mid laner in the NACL, but I think Spyrax, in terms of a complete package for me, has just offered a tad bit more. I think Quad is definitely better in lane. I think he's more explosive and his mechanics are better, but I think Spyrax, as a player that plays with his team, actively opens up the map just a tad bit more for Maryville. I think they're both very good, but this is kind of the example of the more negative aspects that we saw out of Spyrax for a bit of last year. We talked about it in spring of last year, where Spyrax was somebody that I expected to go into 2023 with this crazy amount of momentum for Fly. I felt like he got better every single game when he was introduced, but it didn't necessarily happen until summer ended up rolling around, or playoffs really in spring ended up rolling around, and he kind of, you know, piggybacked off of that here with Maryville to be one of the more interesting mids in the region, but this was not a good performance. His Orianna in particular in Game 2 I thought was really poor, but the Yone I don't think stepped up all that much in Game 3. Game 2 was a bit of a blowout, so it's hard to kind of get a really good idea. And he picked Ryze in Game 1. Ryze is just not particularly playable in my eyes right now. Not a champion that I think is strong, at least from what I have played at the solo queue level. I don't think Ryze is in a great spot. I think Niles is also the other player that you're looking at saying, you know, Tenacity was just straight up better than him in this series. Niles has been good for this team, maybe not elite, but certainly good, like upper echelon, you know, above average in terms of NACL top laners. But when you go up against a player like Tenacity, you have to be able to keep up in terms of aggression, and that didn't happen on the top side of the map. Jerry and Zyko weren't nearly as good in this series as they have been in recent weeks. They have been a super strong point for Maryville. Jerry's been one of, if not the best AD carry in the NACL. Zyko has certainly been one of the best supports, and that didn't match. Yuji had a couple of good moments, especially in Game 1. You know, I think Game 3 was also okay from him on the Taliyah, but outside of that, there really wasn't a lot to like of how Maryville played this. They came into this as pretty major favorites, and they just weren't able to get the job done. Now, on paper, could you say that DSG, you know, in the preseason would have been favorites for this, you know, taking away form? Yes, but with the way these two teams have played, this is a big loss and a bad one for Maryville, because like I said, this side of the bracket is not a forgiving one. You're going to have to play a good team in the lower bracket, and that means you are one series away from elimination now, and that's really not where you want to be in this particular circumstance. But for DSG, this is a huge win. If this is the confidence builder that they needed in order to get onto the track that they've needed to be all along, onto, you know, the part of the league that they've needed to be all along, an upper echelon team that can start winning and be one of the favorites to win the NACL, if this is what they needed to do to get there, then that's massive. This team does have a clear play style, in my opinion. Tenacity is incredibly important towards what this team wants to do, and Perry's aggressiveness is going to get them into trouble sometimes if they're not able to get early leads, but they are so mechanically talented that even against the best teams, we know they can go toe-to-toe with them. them. It's a very interesting team, but this is a good showcase of what they can do at their best. And then moving on to our final of the round one, or at least upper bracket round one series here. And this was the one that I thought was the most interesting on paper in terms of the round one matchups. The 3-seeded Supernova taking on the 6-seeded Team Liquid Challengers. Two top 4 teams, in my opinion, unfortunately facing off against each other. And Team Liquid is going to take this one 2-1. You would sit here and say this is an upset in terms of seeding, and especially because it really does feel like a top 3, or at least it did in terms of, you know, the teams going into the playoffs. It felt like FlyQuest, Maryville, and Supernova were just kind of ahead of everybody else, but as we saw with Maryville, nobody is untouchable right now. Even FlyQuest dropped a game to AOE and almost dropped 2 to AOE in their series. It really feels like this entire tournament is a lot more variable than people were expecting, and Team Liquid definitely showed that off here, but this isn't a particularly big surprise. We knew Team Liquid was a good team, and they started to get a bit better as the split went along. Supernova not being able to take them down is not the biggest upset that we've seen this week. However, they were favorites going into the series, and they just unfortunately were not able to get the job done. So let's go ahead and talk about why. Well, player of the series for me finally starting to step up. It's Romer in the mid lane. I had Romer as the #1 mid laner going into the year. When you watch his Challengers League tape, it's hard not to see him as somebody that could make a difference at a higher level than even this in terms of the mechanics that he could offer. He's really not been that guy over the course of this split. It's really taken him a lot of time to get into a comfortable pattern. It never really felt like him and Keel were on the same page. Keel has actually been relatively invisible over the course of this split. I don't think he's played particularly well, especially in comparison to what he was last year for Wildcard, where he was an MVP candidate. I think this bot lane's been a little up and down. Jenkins has gotten better, but he's also been up and down. There's been a lot of turmoil, and I think that's hurt Romer's ability to be this primary carry, but you put him in a situation on Talia and Hui where he's a lot more comfortable playing champions that I think he does better on. Like, obviously, he's good on Tristana, and he's good on these aggressive picks, but I like him on mages a lot. And he took over the back half of this series. Both of the final 2 games were really, you know, kind of played around Romer, if you will, in terms of the plays that he was making. Even if he wasn't the primary damage dealer or the primary carry, I think Romer was really the reason that they were in those situations to begin with. So he's going to get player of the series for me. Hopefully this is some sort of trend that he can continue living up to, because, you know, we've seen some imports take a little bit of time to get used to playing in North America, especially when there isn't any other imports on the team, right? There's nobody else on this team that isn't from North America, and so I imagine it's going to take some time to get used to playing in a new environment with, you know, a new culture and everything like that. Romer does seem like he's coming along, but it's always been a consistency thing. He's had good games this split. It's all just been about putting it together for a larger period of time. Spawn and Kim Down were also really good for me in this series. Spawn in particular, I think, showed some things that he wasn't showing in the regular season. In, you know, previous years, I've been a big fan of Spawn. I don't necessarily think he's the most aggressive, mechanically intensive ADC in the entire world, but the player I've always compared him to is Patrick over in the LEC, where I think very similar in terms of style. Like, he's not always going to dominate lane phase. He's not always going to be this guy who plays super aggressive and is stepping up and trying to create plays and sometimes costing his own life in order to generate advantages. He's going to be a lot more stable, going to be a lot more team fight focused, and, you know, that's kind of his play style. But when that works, when you're able to get a mid laner that's moving around the map, creating those macro advantages, allowing Spawn to play things that are a little bit more scale oriented like the Senna, the Varus can take over in lane, and we definitely saw that here. But I think Spawn definitely had a better series than he's had in recent weeks. I've really not been impressed with how this bot lane is played as a duo, and I think both of them played well. Kim Down was good as well. Don't love Thresh. Still think that champion is very overvalued. I love Thresh as a champion. Obviously, I think he's super fun to play. He's one of my highest mastery champions, but it's just not, he's not in a good state right now. I don't think he's particularly strong in comparison to a lot of the other engage kind of, you know, hook champions. Like, he's not Nautilus. He just is worse than Nautilus in almost every way. So I think that cost them in game 1. But Tom, Rel, like, they're a lot better for the circumstance here. Jenkins continues to look really good. I'm actually really liking how he's playing. He has stepped up pretty heavily in the last couple of weeks, and I think he had a good series. And Keel, I thought, was more impactful here than he had been recently. He's kind of been a non-factor, not necessarily a huge negative, but I really haven't said his name a whole ton over the course of this split, and I think a lot of that is just because him and Romer have not developed that synergy. But this is a good win for Team Liquid. Not particularly surprising. Like, Supernova is a really good team, but so is Team Liquid. We knew both of these were good going into this, you know, matchup. This is why this is the harder side of the bracket, because one of these teams was guaranteed to go down into lower bracket, and unfortunately, that's going to be Supernova here. You know, you would have hoped for maybe a bit of a better performance. I think that there are definitely some feast or famine aspects to Supernova's style because they rely so much on a couple of their individual players, namely Kenvi and Shochi. This jungle mid is so integral towards how Supernova play the game that when they're set behind, when they're not quite as active in the mid game, when they can't skirmish nearly as effectively from ahead, this team is going to struggle to some regard. Shochi is unfortunately going to get my dud of the series here. I think generally he was fine, but he was just caught out in situations where he didn't need to be caught out in. That's going to be something we talk about for a lot of mid laners, is that, you know, it's really important that you are in situations that don't risk gold going over to the enemy mid laner, because on Taliyah, on Hui, the game can snowball out of control very quickly, especially in a meta where bot lane hyper carries are a little bit more common. They weren't necessarily common in this series, but, you know, when you look at the Yone, not a great game. When you look at the Ahri, caught out a little bit more, even if his damage was there for some of these fights. Same thing with Kenvi. I thought the Nidalee was a complete flop in game number 2. It just did not work out. If you're going to go for something like that, you have to have pressure early, especially into something like Jax Taliyah, who's just going to beat you in the late game, and they weren't able to get that. I also want to shout out that Array was not particularly good in this series. He's been more feast or famine than I expected. He's been very stable, I would say, over his time in tier 2, going back to his academy days, even last year on Golden Guardians. He's always been someone you can reliably count on to be there, but Spawn was just better than him in this series, and I think that was apparent. Diamond has been one of the best supports in the NACL, and he didn't necessarily do a whole ton, although I don't think it was necessarily his fault. And Faisal was fine, but Jenkins was better on the other side of this matchup. For Supernova, not a good situation. You drop this series, which means you move down, and you got the worst case scenario coming up anyways, because not only are you dropping down to lower bracket, but so is Maryville, and you have to face them. One of those two teams is going to be one of the first two teams out of the playoffs, and that feels absolutely ludicrous considering both of them felt like locked top 3 going into the playoffs. It's a disastrous poll here for Supernova. Both of these teams got a bad draw, but Supernova, unfortunately, is the one who's going to have to suffer more because of it. And for Team Liquid, they're moving on now. They get to face DSG. That is a significantly easier challenge than I think they were anticipating. Not because DSG is an easy team to beat, but rather because I think DSG has notable holes, has ways that you can take advantage of their playstyle. I think TLC is certainly not a locked-in team to make top 3 or anything like that, but I do think that they are, you know, a team that's getting better, and especially if Roamer is taking over as a carry, this is going to be a scary team to face. But that's going to wrap up round number 1 at the very least. We still have some series to cover because now we get to move on into winners round number 2. I know we're moving into round 2. We'll move back to losers round 1 just a little bit later. But starting with winners bracket round 2, by the end of this, we are going to know our 2 teams to qualify for winners finals already after the first weekend here in the NACL. So obviously both of these series matter a lot. The 4 teams that won earlier on this weekend. First off, it's the top side of the bracket, FlyQuest Challengers taking on Cincinnati Fear. And FlyQuest is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. Obviously, they were favorites going into a series like this, but Fear is pretty notorious for being able to punch above their weight. That's kind of the thing that they have always done, is play better than, not their talent level, but maybe than the expectations around the team, especially when they're going against some of the best teams in the league. But unfortunately, FlyQuest just a little bit too strong. They do drop a game to Fear, and Fear looks great in game 2. There's a lot of positive things to talk about when it comes to how they played this series in general, but FlyQuest was just a tad bit better, and a lot of that is once again off the back of Shaden in the jungle, who's already making a case that he is going to be the most important player as we continue on through the playoffs here. He's obviously been great for FlyQuest the entirety of this split, but in their first 2 series, he really has been the best player in both of them, and that's majorly important. As good as he was in their first series against AOE, there still was a lot of confusion. The macro wasn't exactly perfect, and Shaden did step up when it mattered, but it was a more, I would say undersold kind of performance. It was a Sejuani, and it was a lot of creation through facilitation, and that's not necessarily the most eye-catching way to play the game. Well, here you've got a Xin Zhao and a Kindred performance, specifically the Kindred performance, where he just absolutely pops off and destroys Cincinnati Fear. So if you wanted your carry-oriented style back from Shaden, if you wanted him to look a little bit more dominant on damage picks, here is the series for you. He looked amazing here. Shaden is obviously fantastic. He has really solidified a lot of the consistency issues that I thought he had on Evil Geniuses last year. That has not been a problem so far this year. I think the rest of the team was obviously also very good, but Shaden was the standout for me, and I think for basically everybody else. Quad was good, and Quad's been better in the playoffs at actually taking resources. I think that was something that was a bit of a positive for FlyQuest, but also a bit of a negative in the fact that mid lane is so strong, and you want to move it around the map, and it can be such a power point, but Quad was a bit low resource in terms of how he played a lot of the mid games, in terms of where he was with the rest of the team. He left it a lot up to Surdy and Shaden, Shaden in particular. He's been more of a focal point for what FlyQuest want to do here in the playoffs, and I think that's helped them a lot. Toasty is a very good player, and he's been playing well, but Quad was just better. Surdy was also really solid here. Definitely the better of the two top laners. Sajed and Chime were good. I don't think they were great, but they were good enough to be able to win. And Shaden, like I said, was really a superstar in this series. I know it's not necessarily accurate or fair to point to one player and say that they are the reason that this team is moving on in the playoffs to winners finals, but Shaden has been the guy for FlyQuest in their 2 playoff series so far. I think if he has not played as well as he has in their first 4 wins, their first 6 games, I don't think they're moving on to winners finals. I think that's the kind of difference that he has made, and so I really want to highlight that, I guess. And then for Fear on the other side, again, some positive things to take away here. I genuinely think that the team played well in this series. I don't obviously expect them to be able to take down a team like FlyQuest, but to be able to go up against them and actually compete and be relevant in this series, it is very impressive for them. Unfortunately, I do have to give a dud of the series, and that's going to go to Dapshin in this one. I like Dapshin a lot. In fact, I've praised him quite a bit over the course of this split. I think he has been very consistent. You know, sometimes Lens will have good games and bad games. He'll be relevant and then not relevant. Dapshin is usually the one that is keeping the team kind of together in the bot lane. Not that Lens is a bad player, just that, you know, it's just a bit more feast or famine, but Dapshin's very consistent, unfortunately. I just didn't love how he played the Rel in game 3 here. I think some of those engages were too aggressive, and I think he kind of got outplayed by the Rakan, by Chime on the other side of this matchup. I think if that hadn't been as much of a pressing issue for the team, this could have gone a bit differently, but I do want to shout out Chad, Toasty, and Lens, who I think all played at least relatively well. Toasty continues to not really be a problem at all for this team. Sometimes can struggle with making the big play, sometimes plays it a little bit too safe, but I can understand why you might want to do it considering you're playing Talia and Orianna in these matchups. It's not always your responsibility to be the one to go out there and make the big plays. Oftentimes that's going to be left up to Chad in this particular instance, and Chad I think did play well, was creating advantages, maybe could have been more aggressive. He was kind of the opposite of, you know, what I was talking about there. Maybe he could have actually gone and made more risky plays, which is kind of what we know Chad for, but it was much more of an undersold passive series from Chad. I don't think he made any major mistakes, but Shaden definitely was able to get the advantage, even if he was relatively okay. And then Lens was fine. You know, Philip lost in the top lane, but you can live with that. Like, this is an okay series for Fear. It's unfortunate that you do have to move down into lower bracket, but this was expected. FlyQuest looks like the best team in the league right now, and losing to them is certainly not a bad thing. You are also, in my opinion, on the harder side. Going down into the lower bracket, you have to play the winner of Maryville and Supernova, and that's going to be a tough matchup basically no matter what. So the challenges don't get easier for Fear, and obviously it's the playoffs. Like, you got to step up and you got to show up, or you're not going to be one of the best teams. But it's definitely an unfortunate kind of turn of events there. But for FlyQuest, they move on to winners finals. Of course, they play the winner of the next series that we're going to talk about. They're already one series away from grand finals. I think a lot of people anticipated them being the best team in the NACL, winning the NACL title. They are very, very close already, 2 series away already from being NACL champions. And if they weren't your favorites going into the split or going into the playoffs, I think they certainly have to be, at least at the current moment. And then moving on to our other winners round 2 series of this weekend, and it is a good one. 2 teams that were underdogs going into their first round series, trying to see if they can push their way into winners finals. It's a big series between Team Liquid challengers and Disguised that Team Liquid is going to win. It's kind of apropos, poetic, if you will, that the 2 LCS-affiliated challengers teams are the 2 teams to make winners finals, regardless of what happened in the regular season with TL being the number 6 seed. But obviously, Team Liquid had been overperforming their playstyle for most of the year. The talent level of this team was simply just too high for us to believe that they weren't going to figure something out, and that's exactly what they did here. I've never really been a huge fan of this collection of players. I don't think all of them have lived up to expectations so far this year, but they're starting to really come together as a unit. And a lot of these players are players that are kind of notorious for getting better when games matter more. And so, you know, we're really starting to see that for DSG. Obviously, it was great that they upset Maryville. I think that already is a big positive for them, but they move down now into the lower bracket. Their week is now done because they will now play the loser of the Wildcard AOE series that we get later. So definitely the easier side of the bracket for them, but we'll talk about that as we continue on. It's important to talk about what happened here in round number 2, because there's a lot to like from how Team Liquid played this series. Player of the series for me is pretty obviously going to go to Spawn. He was the primary central focus for what this team wanted to do. Like, maybe you could give it to Roamer. Maybe you could give it to Kim Down. I think Kim Down played really well in this series, but Spawn really was the player that they were trying to facilitate, and this has actually become kind of a regular occurrence for Spawn once you get into playoffs here in the NACL. We've talked about him not necessarily being the most aggressive, dominant AD carry carry in the world, somebody that is a little bit more system-oriented, that does need good players around him to facilitate him generating those leads. But man, with a lead, he is incredibly good. And one thing that has been very clear about Spawn for every year that he's played in Tier 2 is that in the playoffs, he just gets better. He becomes a hyper carry in the playoffs. He did it for Dignitas for so many years. Like, he's just kind of always been this kind of player where once you get into these more important games, he starts to step up. And so to see him really step up against DSG and start to play better in the playoffs, and him and Kim Down start to get on the same page, it's not surprising. Team Liquid as an org has always been an org that specifically in Tier 2 has gotten better once you've gotten into the playoffs. And so seeing Spawn and Kim Down really get on the same page for a series like this, not shocking. Spawn played great. Kim Down was awesome. Loved him on the Rel, loved him on the Blitzcrank. As a facilitator and a playmaker, he was exceptional in this series, was everywhere on the map, constantly setting up opportunities for both Roamer and Spawn and Jenkins on the Rumble in particular in Game 2 to create a lot of positive action. Really like what we saw out of him. Roamer was, again, really good in this series. Don't love him on something like a Corki. I think it's just a little bit too slow for maybe the style that I personally would want to go to for Team Liquid, but, you know, Spawn is a late game hyper carry. Keel's a little bit better in team fights. Jenkins a good team fighter. I understand why you might just want to slow down the pace, and something like Corki does help that. I just don't know if this is the meta for it. Wasn't quite punished by the Aurelia in the way that maybe you could have been. Generally, Roamer, Spawn, and Kim Down were the most important players, but Jenkins, like I said, was awesome, particularly in Game 2 on the Rumble where he was really good, and then Keel finally got to play one of his signature champions. It feels like they've gone the entire split without allowing him to play any of the things that he's notoriously good for, and he finally got to play the Nunu here in Game 3. You know, those pocket picks were a big reason why he was kind of a difference maker for Wildcard last year, is he would be able to pull out Nunu and Karthus, and he'd be able to dominate on these champions more so than other players would be able to counter them, and I think Heel was very good here. Maybe not the star of the team or anything, that definitely went towards the bottom side of the map, but I think this is a good sign that Team Liquid, as games are getting more important, are going to at least kind of try to buy into some of their players' strengths rather than just trying to get them to adjust to the meta. This was a very good series from them, and they deserve to be moving on to winners finals here. Unfortunately for DSG, you would think after a pretty big upset you would get something easier than the 2 seed going into round number 2. Unfortunately, Team Liquid is one of the harder 6 seeds that you will ever run into, and so they had to run into them in the second round, but there were some mistakes made by this team. I really don't think they played particularly well down the stretch. Obviously, Game 1 was very good, and everybody really contributed to that. I think Manui in particular had a great Game 1. Smolder looks like a very strong champion from ahead, as we all know, but the rest of the series was a bit of a downtrodden experience, I would say, for DSG. Dead of the series for me is going to go to Perry. It's just hard to look any other way. I don't necessarily entirely blame Perry for the way that things go when this team loses, but as a very aggressive player, somebody who is going to go out there and take a lot of risks, who is going to go out there and skirmish when things aren't going well, when you're playing from behind, inherently that style is just going to be less effective, and then you get games like Game 3 where you go 0-9, and it's just not particularly good. You lose pressure really fast, and the game kind of spirals out of control. It was far from just Perry that struggled. Manui, after a good Game 1, I think really struggled in the second and third games of this series. Poom and Manui have never really been on the same page, in my opinion. Throughout this year, it feels like communication just isn't always perfect between those two, like it was for Manui and his myriad of supports, Trevor and JJ, last year. And then Tenacity, I think, had one of his worst games in a while here towards the back half in Game number 2 on the Aatrox. I think he just got absolutely outplayed by Jenkins on his signature Rumble. So there were a lot of flaws, a lot of problems, in my opinion, with how DSG ended up playing this series. However, you're not down, you're not out. Like I said, you're on the easier side of the lower bracket. You have to play the winner of Wildcard and AOE. Both of those teams, DSG should absolutely be favorites to play against. In my opinion, those are the 2 weakest teams in the playoffs, and so for DSG to be on that side of the bracket, it does put them in a good position to, at the very least, try to get themselves into top 4. Now, are they going to be able to get higher than that? That remains to be seen. This team still has a lot of holes. They still have a very defined play style, and they're very feast or famine because of just how poor they play from behind in terms of resources, but they are talented enough to get leads against teams that they are better than, as was shown in the first series of the playoffs here. But for Team Liquid, congratulations to them. Their week is now done as well, but in a good way where they still have their extra life. They're moving on to winners finals. They're going to take on FlyQuest, and that's going to be a really fun series to kind of see. They're definitely going to be underdogs in that, which, you know, they're kind of used to throughout this playoff run, but if anybody can over-exceed expectations, if any org is going to do that, it's almost certainly going to be Team Liquid. And then moving in now to our final 2 series of the video, and they are important because by the end of these 2 series, we will know our first 2 teams eliminated from the playoffs here. Of course, it's lower bracket round number 1, the teams that lost in the first round going up against each other, and we started off with a match between the 4-seeded Wildcard Gaming and the 8-seeded AOE Esports. That AOE is going to win comfortably 2-0. That means Wildcard Gaming, our number 4 seed going into the playoffs, is the first team officially eliminated from the NACL Spring Split Playoffs here in 2024. It's not a huge surprise. I mean, AOE beating Wildcard is a bit of an upset, at least in my opinion, because Wildcard, I think, had looked better over the course of the regular season, or at least a tad bit more consistent, but AOE had a better game score across the regular season, and so you could really say that, honestly, they were better. The big strength of Wildcard to me was their bot lane of Aaron and Doxa, and I think Wixie and Breezy have been just as good, if not better, over the course of the regular season, and that really points to AOE being favored in a head-to-head matchup, and so I'm not entirely shocked by the outcome of this, especially with how both of these teams looked in round 1. It's just got to be disappointing for Wildcard, a team that I think definitely expected to do better in this tournament, and unfortunately is going to be out in round 1. AOE, though, looking very good, and I think they've looked way better than expectation going into this next part of the playoffs. I think going into playoffs in general, people didn't have high expectations of this team. I didn't have high expectations of this team, but it really does feel like they are locking in right now, starting to show some of the good that they were showing in the regular season. The problem was never that their good games weren't good enough. Their good games were always good enough. It's just that, you know, game to game, you would get a little bit more variance from them than you would other teams, and it didn't feel like it particularly leaned on any one thing. It just felt like the team in general was inconsistent. But if you are going to get these levels of good performances over the course of the playoffs, this is a scary team to end up facing, and certainly not one that I would want to play in a best of 3 for my life, which is going to have to be the case. But player of the series for me is going to go to Onat. Again, how much more can I say about Onat? I'm part of the O Nation. I have rocked out with him all year long. I've really been impressed with what he has shown in the NACL this year, especially considering I wasn't overly impressed with him last year. I thought he was good. I thought he was fine, like an average to maybe slightly below average mid laner for the level, considering how good the mid lane talent was last year. But, you know, I think he stepped up a lot over the course of 2024, and this year has kind of been a breakout for me, at least when it comes to Onat. I thought he was great in this series. I think there is a realistic case to be made that he is not player of the series, but I thought the Ahri and the Talia moving around the map, creating the most amount of action, really opening up everything for the rest of the team was probably the most important aspect. But if you wanted to give it to either Wixie or Breezy, I think they also deserve it as well. They were terrific here. Wixie in particular, throw him on a hyper carry and just let him go to work. He has been very good with resources over the course of this split. This bot lane in general has really not been anything but a positive, even if they've not been as much of a positive as other bot lanes, like they're not auto-winning every single game. They never really lose, and I think that that is a huge upside for a team that is like closer to the bottom of the standings. You don't usually get bot lanes that are as consistent as Wixie and Breezy are on teams that aren't going to be near the top of the standings. So credit to Wixie and credit to Breezy, both players who I've really praised on this channel in the past. Breezy has always been a bit of a channel darling, but I think it's Wixie that stood out to me more in 2024 in terms of why this bot lane is succeeding. It's just nice to see 2 veterans get back together on the same team, you know, really start to rejuvenate each other and, you know, look better than they have in quite a while, in my opinion. Breezy's continued to look good, but Wixie getting another shot here after the Immortal situation last year, I think is well deserved. He has more than, you know, made his mark back here in the NACL in Tier 2. Zamudo was very good here, definitely better than Quacker on the other side. Rosethorn was definitely better than Winnie on the other side of this matchup, and those are the 2 players that I talked about last, and so that's how you know this series ended up going in a good direction for AOE. Generally, this was a team performance. It was just a domination 5v5 from AOE versus Wildcard. They were the better team from basically moment 1 to the last minute of the series here in game number 2. It was really kind of a stomp, and you got to be impressed with what they were able to show off. And then, unfortunately for Wildcard, that does make them the first team to be eliminated here from the playoffs in 2024. Didn't really see this one coming. I did predict them to lose in round 1, but I didn't think they would be losing to AOE. Like I said earlier, the more you examine the matchup, the more I do see it as rather difficult for them because they do rely on their bot lane so much, or alternatively, they need their top lane to just win, and that could have been a win condition for them if Quacker just showed up and really dominated Zamudo, which I think is definitely possible. However, Quacker did not play particularly well in this series, and that means that this game just kind of got, or these games kind of got out of hand very quickly quickly for them. Dud of the series, unfortunately for me, is going to go to Winnie. You know, I really try to refrain from, like, absolutely tearing players apart. And I don't think Winnie has played so bad that you have to tear him apart, but this was just not a very good split from him, in my opinion. I don't think that this is one of the splits to remember for Winnie. I've never really been the biggest fan. Back to the TSM days, just in general, it's never really clicked for me, but I think when you look at the construction of this team, and especially how well Dox has stepped into that support role, Aaron, I think, made some nice strides over the second half of the year. You know, Darkwings is a good player, Quacker is a good player. It's hard not to look at Winnie kind of not winning a lot of games on carries and not say that that was a bit of a problem for Wildcard. Now, obviously, a lot of this split was him playing facilitators like Sejuani, and that's always going to just generally make you look at least a little bit worse if you're losing, because it's really hard to control the map from a negative perspective, from, you know, a Sejuani standpoint. But, you know, he could have been better on these carries. He was given a lot of priority in the series. Nocturne and Graves, a lot of precedent was put on him. He was really the priority for what Wildcard wanted to get ahead in these drafts, and it just didn't work out, and I'm not necessarily sure that's the direction I personally would have went in. Again, I don't think he's an awful player, but I'm not sure what you do if you're Wildcard going into the next split. Do you make changes to this roster? You know, I like Quacker. I really like Aaron and Dox. I think you should stick them together, and Quacker's very volatile. He had a lot of bad games this split, but his good ones, you know, for the most part, make up for that, I would say. It's all just really about, do you want to make changes in the jungle and the mid lane? Darkwings has shown a lot of potential in the past, but, you know, it's going to be interesting to see where they move in this offseason. But for AOE, you know, this is a very good win. I'm not saying that this is going to be the start of their top 4 climb here, because now they move on to face DSG, and DSG is a very tough opponent, as we saw with them beating Maryville in round number 1. That's certainly not a team that you can look over, but DSG has known to be rather, you know, inconsistent, and if any team is going to be able to come out and just start firing on all cylinders, take advantage of a potential off day from DSG, put them in uncomfortable positions playing from behind, AOE might actually be that team. I'm not saying that they're definitely going to move on, but I think this is definitely an interesting predicament and an interesting draw for them. And that's going to bring us to our final series of the video in our second series here in the lower bracket in round number 1, our second team to be eliminated, and it's a one team at the very least that's going home significantly too soon for their own expectations. 2 top 3 seeds going into this tournament. Maryville University taking on Supernova. And Maryville University is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. That means somehow, someway, Supernova is out of this tournament in round number 1. I did not think that this was possible with how this team played, not only over the course of the entire split, because obviously over the course of the entire split, this team was amazing. They were very, very good, very consistent. They really only lost games where they clearly took their eye off the ball. But even go back to the most recent week, the final week of the season, they beat FlyQuest. They gave FlyQuest their only loss of the entire year in a best of 3. And now here they are being one of the first teams eliminated, finishing in 7th, 8th place. It just feels non-indicative of how good this team was. This is a very good team that got unlucky against Team Liquid, who is a very good team as well. They're in winners finals, and then they had to draw Maryville, who also just randomly shit the bed. It feels like circumstances all conspired to get Supernova out of this tournament as quickly as possible, but you know, we'll talk about it. You know, we'll talk about Maryville first, because they deserve to be moving on. This is still a great team, and honestly, even after the setback against DSG, this team still has the potential to maybe even go on and win the NACL. Like, the upside is still there for Maryville. Just because they lost that one series doesn't mean that I've lost all of my confidence in them. They're going to have to go on a lower bracket run, but who says they can't do that? Who says they can't be a team that just wins out from here on out? This was a great performance from them. Supernova is not a pushover of a team, and to 2-0 them in such dominating fashion, it's really good stuff. Game 1 was close for a little bit, but really Niles was the one to pull it back out, and that's why he's going to get my player of the series. If you want to look at Game 2 and just say that Scary Jerry got mega fed on the Zeri and say that he deserves player of the series, I totally understand. Game 2 felt like a lot more of a stereotypical Maryville game in terms of how they've played over the course of the year, being able to establish an early lead through Yuji's ridiculous amount of pressure, through Spyrex giving up a lot of pressure in the mid lane to just kind of help out his jungle, and then translating that all to bot lane, allowing Jerry and Zyko to straight up win the game for you. But to me, if Niles doesn't play the way that he does in Game 1, they don't win it, and they don't walk out of this with a 2-0. And so Niles is going to get my player of the series. To me, he was the best player for the team, and genuinely, I think this is the best series that he has played in about a year and a half. Like, I can't even really think back to the last time I was this excited about Niles. Obviously, it was really when he was dominating for Maryville, probably the first time around before he got brought up to LCS prematurely. Like, when's the last time Niles just destroyed destroyed someone like he did in this series. And it wasn't just Faisal, it was the whole team. Like, he just won game 1. And so really impressive stuff from the Aatrox. And the Ornn was still good in game 2, just obviously opportunity is going to be a bit different between an Aatrox carry game and an Ornn game, where the rest of your team has already demolished and you've got a super fed Zeri. The opportunity in terms of making plays is not going to be the same there, but Niles was great. Jerry and Zyko also deserve a big shout out. I've been their biggest proponents in terms of how good they've been in the bot lane, and, you know, they lived up to it in this series. Jerry was awesome in that second game. Zyko did a great job of keeping him alive in some of these fights on the Lulu. Just solid stuff, and then Yuji and Spyrex just needed to do their job. Spyrex was sometimes a little bit too aggressive, and honestly, this wasn't exactly his best performance, coming off of a pretty bad performance in round number 1, or in the upper bracket of round 1 that you would have liked to see him be a little bit better at, but at the same time, like, you'll live with this, and you'll live with how Yuji played, because they were able to win these games, and it's not like they played bad. They played really well as a cohesive 5-man team in those late game team fights, and so, you know, you got to give a lot of credit to Maryville. Their season is still live, but Supernova is done for in 2024, at least in the spring split. Obviously, we still have summer. I would expect this team to not make any changes, and I would expect them to come back for summer with a vengeance. I doubt this is the last we see of this roster unless some of them get picked up for LCS. I really do think that's the ceiling. Players like Kenvi and Shochi are just too good to sit around in the NACL for a while. I know Shochi's going to get another dud of the series here, and he did earlier in the week against Team Liquid as well, but I don't think that's indicative of how Shochi played. I think he had a couple of bad games here and there, and for the most part, I think the team in general played bad around him. And kind of like what we've been talking about with Perry, ironically former Fear teammates, when you're a really aggressive player who is going to be looking for a lot of these angles, especially when you're playing something like Annie in game number 1 that's relatively low range, that does kind of have to step up in order to be useful, you're either not really doing a lot of damage in fights if you're behind, or you're just kind of walking up, doing your thing, and dying instantly. It's really hard to be relevant, and unfortunately, Shochi got caught out a couple of times towards the back half of game number 1, and the Talia just wasn't great, but it wasn't Shochi's fault. Like, he's not the person who solo lost this series. Kenvi got outplayed, specifically in the second game here on Wukong, where there was just no pressure on the map. Faisal wasn't nearly on the same level as Niles, and Array and Diamond weren't nearly as good as Scary Jerry and Zyko on the other side of this. This was just Supernova losing, and, you know, you've got to live with that. If it was to a team that was worse than Maryville, if it was to a team that was worse than Team Liquid, I would feel worse about it, but they unfortunately just had to play probably 2 of the top 3 teams in the NACL, or at least 2 of my projected top 3 teams in the NACL, and they couldn't quite get over it, and that's okay. Like, this could be the 3rd or 4th best team in the NACL right now, and they could still be out because of the strength of their schedule. That's just how the cookie crumbles sometimes, but I would expect a lot of bounce back. I think Kenvi was an all-pro caliber player, an MVP candidate for most of this year. Shochi really was the person who enabled him to do a lot of the carry things that he did over the course of this split. He was one of the best mid laners in the NACL. Diamond was one of the best supports in the NACL, and a nice bounce back here. Array, I thought, was very good. Faisal was very solid. Like, Supernova is a very good team, and this is kind of like I don't know, a 98th percentile outcome. Like, I can't imagine it could ever possibly get worse than this, even though they took a game off of Team Liquid, I guess. You know, there's just no circumstance where they end another split like this. This was a 1 in a million unfortunate draw for them, and they just, they're going to have to bounce back in summer. And then for Maryville, you know, obviously I'm happy that they're moving on. It's really good to see this team continue to step up. There was real questions about whether or not they were going to be one of the first teams out because they have been overperforming in the regular season, but no, they take care of this series easily. The unfortunate part is it doesn't get it entirely easier moving on to the next round. You have to take on Cincinnati Fear, who is not going to be a pushover by any means, and Maryville still is going to have to work hard, but if we know anything, we know that this team is talented enough to make that run, to continue on this lower bracket grind, and honestly, I wouldn't count them out from even still being champions. Alright, but that is going to do it for my NACL Round 1 overview and analysis video here in the Spring Split Playoffs. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Of course, up on the screen you can see the updated bracket after the first round and a half, essentially. Round 2 is basically already done with as well of the NACL Playoffs. FlyQuest and Team Liquid Challengers both sitting in winners finals. They will play next weekend. We have DSG taking on AOE, Fear taking on Maryville down in the lower bracket. I'm really intrigued to see how these series go. If I had to quickly throw off 3 rapid fire winners that are projected from me, FlyQuest, DSG, Maryville, I expect to be the 3 teams that are moving on. Team Liquid obviously down into winners finals, and then between DSG and Maryville, I would expect Maryville to be able to get revenge from that series earlier on in the first round. But I would love to know what you guys think of everything down in the comments section below. I'm genuinely curious about what you guys think is going to happen as we continue to go on in the playoffs. There have been so many upsets and so many weird things happening already that I'm interested to know if you guys think differently than I do. too if you think that maybe some of the results in the earlier rounds were a little bit more predictable or that they're not as surprising to you. Would just love to know your thoughts and opinions on everything going on the NACL down in the comment section below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We don't only post about the NACL. Of course, playoffs are still going to keep rolling along, but LCS playoffs are also going on right now. We've got a lot of that coverage on this channel, and weekly we cover the LEC, the LCK, the LPL. They're all going to be starting their own playoffs very shortly here. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in AOE Esports, especially right before MSI right now, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.